First of all, thank you very much, Professor Giorgio, for being here with us. I have to start with a disclaimer. I am not Antonio Costa Pinto. Antonio is very sorry he cannot be here today, but due to the unstable political situation in Portugal, he has to go and comment on television. Okay, so our apologies. Professor Giorgio graduated in law with full marks at the University of Turin in 2009, and where he attended the high specialization seminar in public law, established thanks to a joint cooperation between the University of Florence and the Italian Parliament. He got a research scholarship and published a survey about political representation, which is, I believe, his main theme tonight. He has a PhD in public law from the University of Bologna, a thesis about the two powers held by the Italian president, the promulgation and publication of legislative acts. He is a member of the board of directors of the Italian Association of Cultural Centers and deputy president of the Frassati Cultural Center in Turin. He's also a member of the scientific committee of this winter school, The Art of Politics, and he is the author of many publications on legal matters for the magazine Quaderni Costituzionali, published by Il Molino. I'm always afraid to speak in Italian next to Rui. And for the magazine of the Italian Research Center on Parliamentary Studies. So thank you very much, Professor Giorgio. The floor is yours.
Thanks to the Instituto Amaro da Costa for the invitation. I'm very happy to stay here and to talk together about the political representation. My lesson in 4 points. Historical terms and theories of political representation. 1. Europe has recently been through a tremendous crisis, which is not only financial, but also, especially for some aspects, mainly political as well as social. A crisis leading both institutions and citizens to reconsider many fundamental elements for the whole process of European integration. Started after the Second World War. Among such critical elements, there is the democratic system of political representation, showing its different shapes: political instability, non-governability, electoral absenteeism, protesting antagonist movements, governments increasingly overwhelmed by technical and bureaucratic elements and expressing people's will less and less. The reasons of such crises are varied and not all of them can be known or knowable. The aim of this short dialogue is to try, on the one hand, to go through the historical and juridical elements of the political representation, especially in Europe. And on the other, to try to highlight and understand which could be the problematic elements lately affecting the model of political representation as conceived by the main European institutions. Scientific literature does not provide a true univocal definition of political representation. By and large, one can say that political representation is a juridical element, for some aspects even administrative, allowing some people to decide and act in favor of a wider and more organized or anyway legally defined social group. For example, residents in the same city or citizens of the same state. Different and not to be confused is a juridical representation, an essentially private law institute, disciplined by different national law codes. Countless have been, in fact, the attempts to define in a clear way contents and characteristics, what mechanisms are at the basis of the relationships between representatives and represented. Rousseau deemed true representation impossible, saying sovereignty cannot be represented, and considered as against the natural order of things the existence of a ruling majority and a ruled minority. The only practicable way is therefore through technical representation, where the selected ones are linked by a total identical condition to the people, being their only replicable spokespeople in any moment. Montesquieu's approach is very different, considering political representation as the only practicable way, as the direct representation of all citizens is impossible. For Kelsen, and more recently for Karl Popper, political representation is a necessary fiction, whereas for Orlando, is Italian author, it is the choice of those with greater capacities. Carl Schmitt, instead defines it as general will and not as a will shared by everybody. These two concepts, general will and everybody's wills, appear very similar, through referring to different realities. Everybody's will is the sum of each individual's will, and therefore it could be equal to the number of people represented. The general will, on the other hand, is not the sum of all wills, but it's a synthesis. Representing general will is possible, representing everybody's will is actually impossible. In this passage, the first fundamental and recurring element concerning representation is outlined. Its foundation basically lies on approximation, and the real objective of representation is to start from everybody's indistinct will, the above mentioned will of everybody, and to proceed in a potentially infinite series of approximation to get as close as possible to general will. In a way, and her as well with a good portion of approximation and in imagination, we could say the representation is to juridical science what Pi Greek is for maths. As Pi Greek is used in maths to reach the closest number to the circle area, political representation is used in constitutional law to comply as much as possible with everybody's interests. Then, which should be the basis of an effective democratic system, the concern of democracy is translated into the concern for a democratic government, which is not the people's government, and not even the government of the arithmetic majority of the people. Anyway, that government is the one where the greatest identification between rulers and ruled people lies. along with the least possible condition of oppression of the rulers on the ruled people. We should start from some fundamental questions. What is political representation? Which evidence do historical events highlight? Which are the tools that could be offered today so that the relationships between representatives and represented can be physiological and not pathological? Political representation is mainly a social fact. As old as man, it is expressed as an association-based reality, as the real need of every community, even the tiniest. In each human community, many people tend to put in the hand of few people their requests. This offers a first fundamental element. Political representation exists before the state, its organ and its law. It existed before democracy and its procedures. Thus, how does the law consider the social phenomenon of political representation? It can certainly provide some tools by which this concept can be expressed in the best way possible, elaborating models to promote the coincidence between winning political representation and political power, so that it could coincide with the representation relationship as it is in reality. However, the law cannot and perhaps it must not establish the concept of political representation in one only definition, as it operates by itself as a fact of political life, regardless of the law. Therefore, the law allows its birth development that as per the modes the community considers useful and necessary. The electoral law, the rights of freedom, starting from the freedom of association and thought, and so on. But the law cannot be included in a political representation as such. Where is then the starting point for a problem analysis? Which can be the elements offering the best way to understand the terms of political representation? Political representation as a multi-purpose concept is definitely tied to other subjects. First, to popular sovereignty. Therefore, it is clear that representation as a social fact becomes political representation tout court only where sovereignty belongs to the people. The law tends to search those instruments making such affiliation more effective. For this very reason, a profile of theoretical basis where the concept of popular sovereignty lies must be outlined. The people, a real subject. From all of this clearly emerges how it is necessary to go back to the basis of representation, reflecting about what are the pillars upon which it rests. Any model of representation cannot renounce to the preservation of a bond, of a connection between representatives and represented. These are not only more or less innovating forms of direct participation, referendum, primary election, political workshop, unstable parties, etc. But, I'm sorry. Grazie mille. But relationships, connection, affiliation, existing prior to the state. Relationship whose meaning often frightens those who insistently look for an absolute neutrality which is humanly impossible to achieve. Of course, the reference is to those natural social coagulation, typical of any human community. We do not question the fundamental juridical concepts of neutrality and impartiality, which should never disappear. As term of comparison, it should be kept a real subject, the people, and not its suspected representation as nation, general will and general interest. This serves not only to re-establish the physiological dynamics of political representation, but mainly because the abstract construction of representation is at the origin of several risks. Recent history has shown how short was the transition from the theoretical concepts of nation, general will, general interest, etc., to the concept of sovereign state, going through totalitarian states. As a matter of fact, by using fiction, the ownership of sovereignty and consequent representation power was moved from the people to the people state, therefore reaching a sovereign, ethical, and totalitarian state. Leaving space to fiction or abstraction, in some cases forcing reality, it is then much harder to recognize the boundaries where such fiction or abstraction acts. This domain also includes a big part of the concern connected with the European parliamentarism. In fact, national parliaments, and in part the one in Strasbourg as well, are affected today by the abstractness of some original concepts and the basis of their creation. This can explain the slow but progressive marginalization of the elected chambers, which are those organs expressing at their best a bond with popular representation in favor of reinforcement of the prerogatives of the decision-making organs, governments and judicial authorities, national and international. If the model of representation is poorly designed, the first and maybe the only institutional victim is the parliament. To modern political representation and parliamentarism. When can we place the origin of the modern system of political representation? The transition that made possible the birth of modern parliaments is marked from the moment the representatives consider themselves able to make decisions independently. This can only happen in a system based on the prohibition of imperative mandate, which arises as a necessary condition, although certainly not sufficient to affirm the sovereignty of the Assembly. For example, in England, the model of bound representation, medieval, did not have an abrupt interruption, as it happened in the continent following the Revolution, but merged and evolved with the modern concept of free representation. From this point of view, the evolution of the British parliamentary system is very illustrative. There has been a gradual shift to a free political representation without binding mandate. It did not erase, but rather enhanced the capacity of the Parliament to represent social pluralism, turning it into political unity. In this sense, a key to its interpretation is offered not only by the traditional British pragmatism, but also, and mainly, by a notion of national sovereignty which is not abstract, where no attempt is made to represent the political and spiritual entity fictiously and forcibly to trace it to a unit. In other words, the English experience, unlike the French one, free representation has been built starting from an historical consolidated experience and not making a social tabula rasa, thus developing an unreal concept of representation, impossible indeed, in which from formal equality a national sovereignty is created with several unique individuals. A French nation, later on European, thoroughly chopped at the beginning and reassembled later on only within the boundaries dictated by state procedures. From real subject, the people turns into a socially undifferentiated artificial object. To sum up what in England was a natural evolutionary step due to political divisions and greater social complexity, in France was a more forced and rigid form of time evolution. However, it is important to highlight that the British model, which is not perfect and subject to a representation void, is not a system in some way slavishly portable and adaptable to other contexts. In fact, the British political system, in the course of 3 centuries, has gradually but effectively solved 3 major issues of constitutional and social politics. Relationship with the Church and its prerogatives. Relationship between the aristocracy, emerging middle class, and the crown. Relationship between the elites and the masses. The British political system was able to nip the problem at its very roots. In the case of the relationship between the Church and the state, both functions merged. In the case of relationship with the crown, absolutistic drifts were immediately dashed. They also managed to avoid the radicalization of social conflicts, implementing careful, inclusive policies, as in the case of the claims of workers, effectively brought back within the bounds of the Labour Party, avoiding the onset of any revolutionary or antagonistic option. Three, political parties between mediation of interest and national representation. The global crisis of the political representation model is not, however, a chronic and irreversible crisis. Surely there is a profound difficulty to make fast and clear decisions, and much as possible share and above all certain to for the achievement of the general interest. The model of representation based on party mediation is a recent phenomenon. Labels was among the first to identify as the central point of political representation, the synthesis between general and individual interests. In fact, the party's mediation model allows citizens to choose what they consider the general interest of the country, while taking into account their own particular and concrete interests. In a sense, parties ensure that the people may appear in the political sphere as a really active unit. This ambivalence sheds light on how the party mediation shifts the problem of democracy and representation from the state external system to an internal party system. In fact, if parties become the only mediators between the state and the people, then they will reproduce internally a democratic system comparable in terms of effectiveness to the one guaranteed by the state order. By analyzing the relationship between elected and voter, it is impossible not to consider the role of parties. The connection of the parties with society has been much reduced compared to the past. But the prerogatives of political parties did not follow the same path. You could say that in some cases we are dealing with a party bubble in which the parties have an impact on the administration of the state much more than their level of representation of collective interests. What are the ways to restore the balance so that the activities of the representatives correspond to the reality actually represented? All the above cannot be explained only based on the common grounds observation of the bureaucratic mass party, with a uniform social base and strongly ideological crisis. In fact, an association, an institution, falls into a crisis not only when it no longer responds to the needs of its members, but since they have, in some way, reorganized the safeguard of their interests and have already found or are refining tools and models to meet those same or changed needs. Do not confuse evolution and reorganization with reduction and the basement. I'm finished.
No, it's okay. Then we have the debate.
In this context, it is not enough just to study constitutional law to rebuild a performing system of political representation. But it takes a real experience of social representation to remind us that the need for representation, interests focused on common good, is above all a human dimension and not only a technical and legal construction. Thanks.